All right, Shabbosai, good morning, Guten Chodesh. It is the Schos Baruch Hashem to be able to begin a new month together, learning beautiful Basra, beautiful Masechta, beautiful Gemara, new Mishnah. Today is a day of new beginnings, new month, new Daf, new Mishnah, new exciting adventures ahead of us. Shabbosai, we begin. Unfortunately, we don't yet have a Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Av. And L'Sari Harav, we don't have a sponsor for today's shiur. So, Amir Hashem, we will dedicate our learning in the schos of all of Klal Yisrael. We dedicate our learning in the schos of our precious hostages. May this be the month in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu reunites them with their mishpachas. In the schos of our precious soldiers who are fighting Am Yisrael's wars and Eretz Yisrael's wars on multiple fronts. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu allow them to be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yadehem. And may this new month bring besoros tovos, beautiful tidings, news of geula, news of redemption, news of simchas for all of Klal Yisrael. I will say with that, let us begin. So the Mishnah says as follows: New Mishnah. Kol chazaka she'eni matayna. This is interesting. Remember again, we've been mentioning this principle over the course of the last number of days, but here the Mishnah is actually going to codify it. So the Mishnah says as follows: Any chazaka that doesn't have with it a tainus. Remember again, we've already established that the necessary ingredients to establish chazaka are number one, residency. Right? So the person needs to be in the field or in the house, whatever, the domicile for 3 years. That's number one. Number two, there has to be a taina. Taina means, how did you get this piece of property? How did you come to this? So the Mishnah says, even if you have residency, but you do not have taina, you do not have an explanation or valid halachic explanation as to how you came to this property, then you cannot establish chazaka. Ketzas, let's give the example of this. What does this mean? Amrlo, ma'ata osa b'sof shali. I come home and I find Ruvain in my property. And I say, Ruvain, what are you doing in my field? V'hu omrlo. And Ruvain responds, Shelo amar li adam davar me'olam. Ruvain says, you know what? I'm sorry, no one ever said anything to me. In other words, no one ever told me that this was your property. So the Mishnah says, in a chazaka. That is not a chazaka. In other words, Rabbi say, Ruvain is not, in other words, taina means a definitive claim of ownership. In the absence of a definitive claim of ownership, you can't establish chazaka. So I come to Ruvain and I say, Ruvain, what are you doing in my field? Ruvain says, essentially, I didn't know it was your field. No one ever told me. Then again, that's not a definitive claim of ownership. Therefore, no chazaka. Good. Fine. If you take a look, by the way, at Rashbam, the first Rashbam in the Mishnah, that starts, Kol chazaka she'eni matayna ena chazaka. If you look like a few lines into that, the Rashbam formulates this very beautifully. He says, V'ka'amar, ditzarech lit'on me'iza koach hichzik ba. Ruvain has to be able to provide an explanation as to how he came into possession of this property. V'hilchach, Kevan de ta'an ta'anasa ma'alya shebedin yar lekarkaza umitoch kach hichsig ba kashir chazaka shamru chachamim v'zeh shasak v'lo micha havye chazaka. So if Ruvain could explain how halachically he came into possession of this property, and then coupled with that he's had residency, uncontested residency, for a period of 3 years, that creates ownership. He's v'zeh shasak v'lo micha ba havye chazaka ve'ein ha'ma'arer ne'eman lomer lo al yadi yara lekarka shali ella below reshusi de'imkein la menicha lahachzik. So I'll say, so now you could actually, all these ingredients come together to form a very beautiful formulation. So now it's like this. If Ruvain comes into property, right, and Ruvain explains how halachically this property came into his possession, right? Then coupled with that, the fact that he's been there 3 years. Add on to that I, who is now the claimed, right, supposed owner, never said anything to him. That's what creates chazaka. So therefore, again, in the Mishnah's case, where Ruvain doesn't have a definitive halachic claim as to how he came into this property, rather, essentially, what he seems to be saying is, listen, no one ever said anything, no one ever told me I couldn't be here. That's not a taina. And ultimately, it doesn't create chazaka. It's actually really interesting. Essentially, what the Mishnah is saying is like this: chazaka is created when you have a reason to explain why you are where you are. A statement of just saying, no one ever told me I couldn't be here, is not a valid halachic claim. It's a good metaphor for life as well. So many times in life, we kind of end up where we are because, hey, like, No one told me I couldn't be here. In other words, that I just end up in a spot in life because it's almost like I become Noach on the Teva. Shem Shlomo Hirsch brings down that if you look at the Teva had all. The Torah goes through incredible detail with the various aspects of the Teva. There's one fundamental piece that is missing from the Teva, and that is, Rav Hirsch points out, a rudder. Right? There's no rudder. There's no oars. It doesn't exist, which is such a strange thing. And Rav Hirsch says no, because that was the chap of the Teva. The Teva was not a vehicle to get you from destination A, from point A to point B. The Teva was a vehicle of emunah. You got in, you closed the door, and you went wherever HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to take you. So on one hand, there's a beautiful Teva-like experience in life. That's one piece. But the other piece is, don't get onto the Teva. In other words, put out your rudder, right? A little early, right? Put out your rudder, right? Not your udder, right? Go ahead, take out yours. In other words, decide where you want to go in life. What the Mishnah is describing, in this case over here, is Reuven's like, I don't know, no one told me I couldn't be here, which almost represents a directionless way to live life. Wherever you are in life, understand why you're there. How did you get there? Do you want to be here? If you want to be here, where you are in life, fantastic. Then keep on maximizing that situation. But if you don't want to be here, then extract yourself somehow, some way from this circumstance and put yourself somewhere else. Don't allow yourself to just end up places in life, but make sure you are where you actually need to be. Such an incredible Musar Haskell. The Gemara goes weiter. However, let's say again, same case. I come to Reuven. Reuven's on my property. I say, Reuven, what are you doing on my property? And Reuven says, what am I doing here? You sold it to me. Or, you gave it to me as a gift. Or, avicha machrali, your father sold it to me. Or, avicha nasna li b'matana, or your father gave it to me as a gift. Harezu chazaka. So we'll say, so all of these are cases of chazaka. Why? Because what's happening in these cases? In these cases, Reuven is making a definitive claim. He's making a definitive claim, right? He's explaining how he came into possession. So now he's making a valid halachic claim as to how he came into possession. We'll say that's chazaka. Chazaka is I am here in what's the word? Not predetermined, premeditated way. In other words, I am in this situation because I chose to be in this situation. I bought this property. I acquired this property. It was gifted to me. I was an active participant in acquiring this property. That's chazaka. It works for property. It works for life. When do you have a chazaka in your life? When you could show the situation that I'm in, I'm here because this is where I need to be. Sometimes in life, I'm placed in situations, okay, but you make a choice to remain there. Where you are in life has to be because you've chosen these circumstances, or even if you haven't chosen them, you're maximizing them. That's your life chazaka. You just fall into something, that's not chazaka. So therefore, again, I will say the Gemara, the Mishnah is off by saying, V'abba mishum Yerusha in Ozarach Taina. Now I will say that this is interesting. What about Yerusha? What about, again, Reuven says, I inherited this from my father. So the Mishnah points out over here that is a valid claim as well. And that is a claim that doesn't require a taina. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at the last Rashbam in the Mishnah. It's the first wide line in the Rashbam. In Utzarach taina, lomar heich ba liyad aviv, de'in adam baki bekarkos aviv. Heich ba liyado. So this is actually very interesting. So what this means is as follows. I confront Reuven and say, Reuven, what are you doing on my field? Reuven said, I inherited it from my father. Reuven does not have to bring proof, right, as to how it came to his father. Why? What's the logic? The logic is because children often don't know about the business dealings or property dealings of their parents. So if Reuven makes the claim, I'm here because I inherited this from my father, that's enough of a claim. However, Rashbam does point out, see this mihu raya be'edim boy sharois aviv hochsak ba yom echad. However, what we are going to see is there is some level of proof that is necessary to show that Reuven's father did occupy this field for at least one day. Okay, so now what our Mishnah, we'll come to that. So the idea over here is if Reuven claims, I inherited this, that is a valid claim. Reuven doesn't have to explain where his father got it from, because children often don't know that level of sophisticated detail in the dealings of their parents. But as we're going to see, there does need to be some level of proof that Reuven's father was on this field for at least one day. For at least one day. Okay, Shabbos say, so now we understand the concept of taina. Here we go. Says the Gemara Pshita. Shabbos say, so this is obvious. Now what's obvious? The Mishnah says, obviously, if Reuven doesn't have a taina, then of course he doesn't have chazak. And I will say, let's play this out. Right? I come to my field. I say, Reuven, what are you doing here? Reuven is saying, I don't know. No one ever told me I can't be here. Of course that's not a chazaka. I don't know, why would you think that is a chazaka? Why does the Mishnah even have to explain that Reuven doesn't have ownership as a result of such a weak claim? It's not even a claim. It's not a claim. It's a statement. So the Gemara says, what would you have thought? This is very interesting. Hi Gavra, Mizbin Zabnole. I would have thought like this. Maybe in reality, I sold the field to Reuven. I sold the field to Reuven, right? And therefore, again, so Hi Gavra, Mizban Zabnole, Hi Ara, Ushtara Havele Ve'irkis. So what happened? Reuven bought the field for me. But now what happens? Obviously, I'm trying to go ahead and recant on the sale. The problem is like this. Reuven had a shtar, but he lost it. So now the problem is, if you lose your shtar, you're really out of luck. So what's the issue over here? So now let's play this out. I confront Reuven. So I sold Reuven the field. But now I'm trying to wiggle out of the sale. So what happens? I go over to Reuven. I say, Reuven, what are you doing on my field? So now, really what Reuven wants to say is, what am I doing on your field? I bought it from you. The problem is, if he makes that claim, what's going to happen? What am I going to say? Show me the shtar. Problem is, Reuven has lost the shtar. So now Reuven decides, okay, so he makes this claim, and what's the claim? The claim is, no one ever told me, right, that I couldn't be here. So he says like this, because he knows that if he makes the claim, which is actually the truth in this case, that he bought the field, then the question is going to come, or the request is going to come, fine, show me the shtar. Hilchach lemale anon dilma shtara havilach v'irkas. So we'll say, so listen to this. So we would have thought that maybe like this. This sounds like such a strange claim, right? Let's play this out. I come over to Reuven and I say, Reuven, what are you doing on my field? Reuven says, no one ever told me I can't be here. So now when we, the Beis Din, hear this, we're like, that doesn't make any sense. Why, Reuven, why would you make a claim like that? You don't have to be a Talmudic scholar to know that a claim like that is not going to hold up in court. So what are you trying to do? So maybe we're thinking this, maybe what happened over here is like this. Reuven really is the owner, because the assumption that anyone is staying on a field for a duration of time really is the owner, because that's a certain level of chutzpah to go out and use someone's property if you're not the owner. So maybe Reuven is really the owner. So why is he claiming such a weak claim? Because maybe he bought it, but he lost the shtar, and therefore he realizes that if he claims that he bought it, we're going to ask him to see the shtar, and he can't produce the shtar. So therefore he figures, you know what, let me just make this weak claim. So maybe what we, the Beis Din, need to do is say, Reuven, is it possible that perhaps you really bought the field, but perhaps you lost your shtar? And the Gemara says, Kigon zeh pasach picha le'ilemu. So we'll say, the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Mishnah, literally translated, open your mouth for the mute person. So Shlomo HaMelech is saying, very beautiful, Shlomo HaMelech is saying that sometimes you have to help one who can't help themselves. So maybe in this kind of case, Reuven is the mute, right? Reuven is unable to process a proper claim, so we, the Beis Din, should help him out. Kamash Malon, the Gemara says, no. Kamash Malon, we do not go ahead and start advocating for people in Beis Din. In other words, in a case like this, Shabbosai, it's up for people to advocate for themselves. Beis Din is not going to get into the advocacy business. Rashi says over here, Rashbam, Kamash Malon, it's in the wide lines, about 6 lines in. De'i ta'in ta'anin alei, ve'i lo ta'in anu lo yalfina le'lemitan. So we'll say, therefore the Mishnah teaches me like this. Beis Din does not start creating Reuven's narrative. Rather, again, if Reuven advances a narrative, he advances a taina, Beis Din is happy to hear it and understand it and support it. But if he does not advance a taina, we are not going to create a narrative for him. Now the Rashbam does say something very interesting. Well, see, remember again last week, or no, it must have been actually the week before, we had the sugya of Toin, the Choser v'Toin. Can someone lodge a claim and then go ahead and change their claim? So remember, how do we paskin? We paskin yes and no. Meaning what? You can't say one thing and then totally contradict that first statement. We don't believe that. What you can do is modify your first statement. See, here's what's interesting about this, we'll say. So therefore, again, the Gemara saying is like this. The Mishnah is teaching me that when Reuven gives this weak claim, you might have thought that Beis Din jumps in and modifies, and kind of advances a nuclear, modifies his claim. For Kamashma, no. Beis Din does not advocate on behalf of Reuven. Reuven advocates on behalf of himself. That being said, if Reuven comes along and says, right, I come to Reuven and say, Reuven, what are you doing on my field? And Reuven says, no one ever told me that this was your field. And Beis Din scratches it like, that's your claim? And he's like, no. Really what happens is I bought the field from Silber and now I lost the shtar. Beis Din will allow that modification because that modification makes sense. But we will not advocate that claim on behalf of Reuven. That's the Mishnah is coming to teach me. So if this is the claim that Reuven puts forward, no one ever told me that doesn't establish chazaka, he's ejected from the land. Incredible. Rav Anan shakel bitka, we'll say great case over here. Rav Anan shakel bitka ba'are. We'll say this is a great case. Rav Anan had a field. There was a flood that flooded the field. And I will say what happened. The flood removed all of the boundary markers. So there was like a fence. There was a fence between Rav Anan and his neighbor. So the flood washed away the fence. So now they have to reestablish. So I guess it was the day before surveys, right? So they didn't know exactly where the boundary was, where the border was. So Azal Hadar Guda Ba'are Dechavre. So what happens? I will say. So Rav Anan again, unwittingly, puts back up the fence. Well, he purposely puts back up the fence, but he thought he was putting it really on the border. It turns out that he ended up putting the fence actually a little bit more onto his friend's property. So instead of putting it on the border between his property and his friend's property, he ended up encroaching on his friend's property. Okay? So I'll say, so what happened? So now, remember, to be clear, Rav Anan did not do this purposely. Right? And we're going to see in just a moment, the neighbor obviously had no idea what was going on either. It comes out afterwards that the fence is actually on Rav Anan's neighbor's property. So Rav Nachman, so the neighbor brought Rav Anan to Beis Din, Amarle Zil Hadar. So Rav Nachman says to Rav Anan, give back the land. What's the shaila over here? You put the fence on your friend's property. Give back your neighbor's property. Rav Anan says, but I've been here 3 years. In other words, the fence has been there for 3 years. So I made a chazaka. Ultimately, again, obviously my neighbor never contested it. So what's the shayla? Amar le kiman Rabbi Rabbi Shmuel da amri kol b'fanav la'alter havi chazaka. So what's actually the Gemara says, now the Gemara goes on and says, by the way, it could have been that it was even less than 3 years. Why? Because we also listen to this. We also may mention this. Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Shmuel. Also, we actually have not seen this explicitly. We've seen the Rashbam quoted a number of times. Rabbi Huda and Shmuel say like this. The concept of 3 years for a chazaka only applies when the supposed owner is not in the presence of the occupier. Right? But however, if the supposed owner is in the presence of the occupier, you can establish chazaka even 1 day. What do I mean by that? Supposed to say the assumption is people don't let other people use or live in their property without objecting in some way. So therefore, again, so this concept of 3 years presupposes that the supposed owner, is not in the same place as the occupier. So now we need time. We need time for the supposed owner to come back to you. What's going on? To lodge a complaint. But again, I will say, if you imagine, let's say I own 2 parcels of land, and I live in one, and the other adjacent one is, let's say, again, farming land. Reuven shows up, and he starts using that land. So Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Shmuel hold that halacha l'maisa, if he uses it uncontested for 1 day in my presence, that establishes chazaka. Because if Reuven really wasn't the owner, I would have objected immediately. So now again, I will say, so Rav Hanan claims, listen, maybe I haven't even been here 3 years, but l'maisa, my neighbor's home every single day. He sees that the fence has been there. He never objected. I should establish chazaka on this property. So Amrlei, I'm sorry. So the Gemara says, so let's hilchos hakavasayu. So Ravanan says, we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shmuel. See, we don't paskin like that. We don't paskin like that. We hold that chazaka always takes 3 years. Chazaka always takes 3 years. Fine. Amrlei, va'achil, da'asa v'saya beguda. Badai. Ravanan says, my neighbor helped me build the wall. He helped me build the wall, right? He helped me build the fence. So the fact that he helped me build the fence that was situated on his property indicates that what? That he's ultimately, again, he's mochel. And therefore, again, I should acquire this land. So Rav Nachman says, come on. Amrlei, mechila b'tos he wasn't mochel. He was mistaken. In other words, your neighbor had no idea what was going on. At gufach ihava yades lo avarata ki echi da'at lo ihava yadas hunami lo hava yada. So Rav Nachman says, Ravanan, did you know what was happening? Of course not. Ravanan, had you realized that you were building this wall on your neighbor's property, would you have put it there? Of course not. The only reason you put your wall there is because you made a mistake. When your neighbor was helping you build the wall, why was he helping you build the wall? Why was he helping you build the wall? Because he was also mistaken. He also thought, both of you thought that it was going on the border of your properties. So because you both thought it was going on the border of your properties, therefore, again, this is what's called, Rabbi say, a mechila b'taos. Mechila b'taos means you, so to speak, you forgo a right, but you forgo a right under mistaken premises, under mistaken idea, under mistaken yisod. In other words, Ravanan, you thought you were building the wall on the border. Your neighbor thought you were building the wall on the border. It turned out that you were encroaching on your neighbor's property. There's no chazaka here, right? There's no mechila over here, but rather, again, what do you have over here? Just one word, a taos, a mistake, and a mechila b'taos, mistaken forgiveness, right? Or mistaken yielding, ultimately, again, does not create a presumption of ownership, does not create the chazaka, therefore give back the field, or give back the space. Incredible. Good. Let's go back to another case. Rav Kahana, shakal bitka ba'arei. So we'll say, so what happens? So same case, Rav Kahana had a field, and the field had a border fence, right? And what happened? The flood came and washed away the fence. Azal hadar guda ba'ara delodi day. So same case, Rav Kahana ended up putting back the border fence, but he ended up encroaching on his neighbor's land. So he moved over the border fence, from the border into his neighbor's land. Again, I will say, all of these cases, of course, are accidental. V'taos. None of this chas v'shalom is with the intention to steal land. All a mistake. So what happens? We'll say, Amud Beis. So they brought the case to the neighbor. The neighbor brought the din Torah before Rabbi Yehuda, saying that Rav Kahana had encroached on my field. So what happened? Azal Aisi Trey Sahadi. So we'll say, so this is interesting. So now we've established that Rav Kahana encroached on his neighbor's field. So now what happened? The neighbor brought witnesses, two sets of witnesses end up coming to Beis Din. So what happened? So the Gemara says, Chad Sahada Amar Tarti Utsai Sa'al, V'chad Amar Tlos Utsai Sa'al. So I'll say, so now there was a machlokas. How much of the field did Rav Kahana encroach upon? So one set of witnesses said Rav Kahana encroached upon essentially 2 rows worth of field. The other group of witnesses said 3 rows worth of field. So this all came before Rabbi Yehuda. Amrale zil shalim tarti. So Rabbi Yehuda said to Rav Kahana, okay, the witnesses are contradicting each other, but here's the good news. What do the two sets of witnesses agree upon? What do they agree upon? That you encroached at least upon 2 rows of field. So therefore, again, Rav Kahana moved the border fence 2 rows back. The Gemara says, Amalei zil shlam tarti migo tlas. Because again, all right, you're right. So that 3rd row, there's a machlokas over there. But at least amongst the 2 sets of witnesses, everyone agrees that you encroached at least 2 rows. So Amalei kiman. So Rav Kahana said, one second, Rabbi Yehuda, who are you paskening like? Kiman, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So you're paskening like Rabbi Shimon Elazar. What does Rabbi Shimon Elazar say? Disanyo, Rabbi Shimon Elazar, Lo nechel kubeshan beisila al shtei kitei edim sha'achas omeres mana va'achas omeres masayim So listen, now watch this. This is very interesting. So I have the following case, right? You have two sets of witnesses. One set of witnesses says that Reuven owes Shimon $1,000. The other set of witnesses say that Reuven owes Shimon $2,000. So Shimon Elazar says, in that case, here's the good news. The good news is we could settle on the fact that what? Reuven owes Shimon $1,000. Why? Because essentially both sets of witnesses agree with that. Everyone will say that is true. That is correct. Now again, you'll have one set of witnesses that say he owes him more than that, but Lamaisa, again, both will agree that the statement that Reuven owes Shimon $1,000 is true. So what do Beis Shammai Beis Hillel disagree about? This is very interesting. Akas achas. When you have only one set of witnesses, she'echad omer mana ve'echad omer masayim. So this is interesting. What do you do if you have one set of witnesses? And in that one set of witnesses, witness one says that Reuven owes Shimon $1,000, and witness two says that Reuven owes Shimon $2,000. What do you do in that case? So this is Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai omrim nechlaka edusan. Beis Shammai says the edus is not good, right? Nechlaka edusan. Nechlaka edusan essentially means you have a split testimony. Therefore, you do not really have a valid testimonial unit, and therefore, again, the edus, there's no edus. But Beis Hillel says, no. Even in that case, as much as they are disputing the second 1,000, they are still both fundamentally agreeing on the first 1,000. So we'll say, now again, so let's circle back. So therefore, again, we'll say, what happened over here? So remember again, Rav Kahana, right? But boundary fence was washed away, rebuilt it. Problem is, he ended up building it on his neighbor's property. Two sets of witnesses come along. How much property did he encroach upon? One group of witnesses said 2 rows, other group of witnesses said 3 rows. So Rabbi Yehuda said, okay, Rav Kahana, give your neighbor back at least 2 rows, because that's what everyone agrees on. Okay? So now Rav Kahana says, Rabbi Yehuda, who are you paskening like? Right? Where are you getting that from? So obviously, you're paskening like Rabbi Shimon Elazar, because Rabbi Shimon Elazar is the opinion that says that when you have 2 different groups of witnesses, but there is a common denominator in their testimony, we could seize upon the common denominator, and obviously we'll have to go ahead and just simply set aside the rest of the testimony. So therefore, again, in this case, everyone is agreeing that I encroached at least upon 2 rows of the field. Therefore, that's what you're going to make me chayiv. I amar le vaha ma'asina lacha igarta mima'arava dein halach Rav Shimon Elazar. So we'll say this is great. Here's where it gets great. So watch this. So Rav Kahana says to Rabbi Yehuda, I could bring you a letter from Eretz Yisrael that says that we do not paskin like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean about paskin like Shimon ben Elazar? What that means is, let's say in general, when you have the whole chap of Reb Shimon ben Elazar is like this. In general, the way it works in Eidos is, if you have 2 groups of witnesses that contradict each other, then what's the halacha? They cancel each other out. We're done. We have no testimony. Reb Shimon ben Elazar is the one who's saying that's not necessarily true. If there is some level of common denominator within those 2 groups of witnesses, those 2 testimonies, that works. You could take that. Now that is an interesting analogy. I was about to say, think about this in just a moment. When you have one set of witnesses who say that Reuven owes Shimon $1,000, another set of witnesses that say that Reuven owes Shimon $2,000. So technically speaking, that's contradictory testimony. Right? So again, there's a school of thought that says contradictory testimony, they cancel each other out, throw the whole thing out. Rabbi Shimon Elazar is one who says, well, no, it's not fully contradictory testimony. There's actually a lot they have in common. A lot they have in common is that first 1,000. The only contradiction is the second 1,000. So let's seize upon what we have. So Rav Yehuda is paskening like that Rabbi Shimon Elazar to say that Rav Kahana owes the neighbor at least 2 rows of field. 2 rows of field. Rav Kahana says, well, 1 second. I will bring you a letter from Eretz Yisrael that says we don't paskin like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. But even in that case, where one set of witnesses say Reuven owes Shimon $1,000, second set of witnesses say Reuven owes Shimon $2,000, that's contradictory testimony. We throw the whole thing out. Rav Kahana wants to just, therefore, in my case, where you have one set of witnesses who say that I owe the neighbor 2 rows, another group of witnesses says I owe the neighbor 3 rows, they should cancel each other out, and I should owe the neighbor nothing. That's Rav Kahana's claim to Rabbi Yehuda. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Amarlei l'chitisi. This is great. Rabbi Yehuda says, essentially, bring it, right? Bring it. Bring the letter. Why don't you show me the letter? Show me the letter. When you bring me the letter, we'll talk. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda says, don't tell me about the letters you have from Eretz Yisrael. This is the halachas we're going to pass it. Now, obviously, now what's interesting about this is, so Rabbi Yehuda does acknowledge, if you do bring me a letter from Eretz Yisrael that says that we do not pass in this way, I'm happy to go ahead and certainly take that into account. But until you can produce that letter, as they say, ein al maladaber, there is nothing to discuss. There's no conversation to be had. But this is how we're passing. Incredible. We'll say another story. Hogavra, the dar bekashta ba'alisa arba shani. Interesting case here. There was a guy who lived in an upper story. Right? So we'll say, so Kashta, Rashi says over here is the name of the place, right? He lived in an apartment, an upper story domicile in the city of Kashta for 4 years. All right, fine. Asa Mari de Beisa Ashkechei. So I'll say the person who owned the home came along and said, Ashkechei Amarlei Ma Bo'is Bahai Beisa. So he says to the guy who's living there, right, what are you doing in my apartment? Right? What are you doing in my upper apartment? Amarlei Meplanya Zabinta de Zabna Minach. This is interesting. So we'll say, so let's just play this out for just a second, right? So I come back to my 2-story home. Or to my apartment building, right? In Kashta, this place called Kashta, I find Ruvain living in the upper apartment. I say, Ruvain, what are you doing there? Ruvain said, I bought it from Shimon, who bought it from you. So it was an interesting claim over here, right? So in other words, Ruvain is making a taina, right? His taina is, I bought it from Shimon, and Shimon bought it from you. So okay, so now what happens? So obviously, I'm claiming back. Lie, that never happened. I never sold it to Shimon. I don't know what you're talking about. So I was talking to Rabbi Chia. So the case came before Rabbi Chia. Amarlei, I islacha sahadi didar ba'ihu dizabinta minei afilu chad yoma ukmina labiyada. So I'll say this is great. So Rabbi Chia essentially said like this. Rabbi Chia says to Ruvain, if you can prove that Shimon lived in this apartment for 1 day, I'll uphold your taina. In other words, in order for Ruvain to cement his taina, right? Ruvain's claiming that he bought it from Shimon, who bought it from me. Rabbi Chia says, fine, that's no problem. But what you have to prove is that Shimon had ownership at some point. And again, all you need for that threshold of ownership is just you need witnesses to say that Shimon utilized this property for 1 day. That's all that needs to be done. If you can prove that, then halacha l'maisa, that is going to be enough. V'i low. But if you can't prove that Shimon utilized this property in an ownership capacity for 1 day, then I'm sorry, your taina is not going to be valid. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. It's actually right across. Afilu chad yoma kadei la'ames dvarecha, in order to go and solidify your claim. V'okma biyadach hol v'achzakta b'shnei chazaka v'shuv lo titzayich lahavi idim shalakcha mibaylav osa shemachar lecha mishum detornum liyoresh detornum lokeach deba mishum yerushim mishum mekach eino zarach tanis. So we'll say, what's Rashbam's pointing out something very interesting. So remember again, what is Ruvain claiming? Ruvain's claiming that he bought it from Shimon, who bought it from me. Rabbi Chia says, no problem. All we need from you to prove, in order to prove your taina, you have to prove that Shimon at some point in time was the owner. How do you prove that Shimon was the owner? By producing testimony that he lived and utilized on this piece of property, or lived and or utilized. After Ruvain proves that, Ruvain's taina is solid. He does not have to prove then that he bought it from Shimon. Because remember again, that's the claim that he's making. Claims that he bought it from Shimon. But again, I'm contesting the fact that Shimon never owned this. Once Ruvain can produce testimony that Shimon acted as the owner, or Shimon lived on it for a day, right, then Lamaisa, Ruvain's taina is solid. Incredible. Amarav. So Rav said like this, Haviyasivna kamid de Chavivi. I was sitting in front of Chavivi is my uncle. Now Rashi says over here is Rabbi Chia. Right? So Rav was saying I was sitting in front of my uncle Rabbi Chia, right, who just delivered this psak. V'armilei v'chi ein adam asay likach v'limkar balayla. So here's what's interesting about side. So Rabbi Chia said, in order for Ruvain's claim to be believed that he bought it from Shimon, we have to establish ownership for Shimon. How do you establish ownership for Shimon? Testimony that Shimon lived there for 1 day. For 1 day. So now we'll say, watch this. So I've said, but 1 second. People flip properties. right? And when people flip properties, what happens? They buy it and they can immediately sell it. So just because, in other words, it's possible that Shimon was the owner even if he never lived there for a day. So don't we take into account that possibility? The chazise ledaite, and that's interesting. And I saw, so this is still Rav talking. I saw that according to my uncle Rabbi Chia, I omerle kamay didi zabna minach mehemin. So I'll say, so ultimately again, that if, the chasisi ledaite, and Rav said, and I saw that the logic of my uncle, Rashi says over the first wide line, Rabbi Chia, according to the logic of my uncle, I amar le kamai, if the original owner said, right, kamai, first one said, didi zabna minach, that ultimately, again, I bought it from you, mehemin, ultimately, again, he would be believed, migo, di boy amar le ana zabanta minach. So I will say, because why? Because here's what's interesting. I will say, now, if it's actually really interesting, Migo, that Rav's saying, I saw based on the reasoning of my uncle, that if he were to say, Didi Zabna Minach, he bought it from you, he is believed because he could have made the Migo. What's the Migo, I will say? Ruvain could have said, I bought it from you. Right? In other words, I will say, when Ruvain makes the claim that Shimon bought it from you, the reason he is believed is because he could have made a stronger claim. What could have been his claim? Reuven could have said, I bought it directly from you. Reuven could have taken out the intermediary over here. Instead of saying Shimon bought it from you, he could have said, I bought it from you. And I will say, and that would have been obviously a much stronger claim, because then he's making a taina. He's making a taina, coupled with the fact that he has residency. The fact that he makes, so therefore it's a migo. So migo works whenever you make a weaker claim, but you could have made a stronger claim. By definition, your weaker claim is believed. Amarav, so Amarava, kavasid Rabbi Chia mistabra. Rabbi Chia's logic seems to be very clear, right? Diktani haba mishavosei. So again, what Rabbi Chia's logic is as follows. When I come to Reuven, I say, Reuven, what are you doing in my aliyah? What are you doing in the upper apartments? Reuven says, I bought it from Shimon. Rabbi Chia says, fine, we believe that taina, as long as what? What's the threshold of proof? What does Reuven have to do now? What does Reuven have to do? He has to prove. Now, obviously, if he has a shtar, there's nothing to talk about, right? That's obvious. But if in the absence of a shtar, what Reuven has to prove is that Shimon lived there at least one day. At least one day, right? That's what he has to prove. So now Rava says, the truth is, Rabbi Chia's logic makes a lot of sense. Why? Because it's based on our Mishnah. Diktani, haba mishum Yerusha, eino tzarech taina. We'll say, what did the Mishnah say? What was the last line of the Mishnah? Last line of the Mishnah says that if, right, let's say I come to Reuven. Reuven's living on my field. And Reuven says, I inherited this from my father. Then what's the halacha? The Mishnah said, eino tzarech taina. He doesn't need a taina. I will say, now what does taina mean? The Gemara wants to suggest, taina hu delo boy, ha raya boy. This is fascinating. What doesn't Reuven need? Reuven doesn't need proof to that about how the property became his father's. But what does he need? What does he need? He needs a raya. He does need some level of proof to say that what? That his father lived on this field for at least one day. In other words, what Reuven doesn't have to create is title going back to his father. What he does have to do is produce some level of testimony that his father occupied this field in an ownership capacity for at least one day. So I will say, what is coming out over here is a fascinating idea. That if your claim of ownership is that you purchased it from someone else, what you do need to satisfy legally is produce some level of testimony that the person you bought it from acted as the owner of this field for at least one day. Right? For at least one day. Otherwise, again, now you don't have to prove how that person got to field. You don't have to prove legal titles that person has to the field, but you do have to prove that that person acted as an owner in the field one day. So I claim that I inherited the field, that's fine. But I do have to produce testimony that my father lived or utilized that field for one day. In this case, again, I'm coming back. Reuven's living in my apartment. Reuven says, I bought it from Shimon. That's fine. Just Rabbi Chia says, just produce testimony that Shimon lived in that field or in that apartment for one day. I have the Gemara, maybe not. Vidilma, lo raya by velo taina by. No. Maybe I will say, maybe it's not what the Mishnah means. At least that's not how we read the Mishnah. I thought that the Mishnah meant that halacha l'maisa, that when Reuven claims that he inherited this from his father, he doesn't have to produce any more proof. That's it. He doesn't need a raya, doesn't need a taina. So we'll say, shani lokeach telo shadi duzi bichdei. We'll say it's also possible that a purchaser is different. Why? A person is not going to spend money for no reason. I was about to say, when Reuven is claiming that he bought this property from Shimon, that means he went ahead and he spent money. If he spent money, a person's not going to spend money without going ahead and ascertaining that the seller has true title. Ibailu nira bo mai. So we'll say, so therefore again, I just want to point out what's happening over here. So therefore, here is actually very exciting because we're really putting the meat on the bones with this whole tiny idea. So we've established in the Mishnah that just saying, no one ever told me I couldn't be here is not a sufficient time. You have to make a valid legal claim as to how you came to this property. Now, what the Gemara is now introducing to us over here is, what if my legal claim is, I bought this from someone who bought this from you, right? So Reuven says to me, what am I doing here? I bought this from Shimon who bought it from you. So first of all, the Gemara says, okay, this essentially is taining Yerusha. It's no different than saying, I'm here because I inherited it from my father. In all of these cases, so we'll say, now you notice how this differs from a classic case of taina. What's a classic case of taina? I come to Reuven. Reuven's been on my field for 4 years, right? 3 years, right? I say, Reuven, what are you doing here? What's a classic case of taina? Classic taina? I bought it from you. You bought it from me, from Silber, right? This new case of taina is Reuven says, I bought it from Shimon who bought it from you. So now the Gemara passes like Rabbi Chia says, no problem. That is a valid taina. But what's the legal threshold? What do you have to prove? You have to bring testimony that the person you bought it from, in fact, occupied this land or as an owner for 1 day. That's all. He lived on it, he utilized it, whatever it is, that's the level of proof you have to bring. So if you're claiming Yerusha, you have to bring testimony, ultimately again, that your father lived here for at least a day. You're claiming ultimately again, You're claiming that, right? Reuven's claiming that he bought it from Shimon. No problem. You have to prove that Shimon acted on this as an owner. So they both say, you know what? We'll stop over here for today. I know it's right before the two das. We'll stop over for this last piece. So we'll discuss. Actually, we'll stop over today. Give a minute to put on the phone. So we'll say, so we'll stop here again tomorrow. We'll just finish up this last little shtickle about how much has to have happened on that day in order to go and solidify ownership. We'll say, Shkoyah, Hagun Chodesh. All right, Chevron, have a wonderful day, everyone. A good Chodesh.